The forests of North America whispered with tension. To the east, along the rocky shores of the Atlantic, English colonies multiplied. Farmers carved out fields, towns grew along the coast, and ships carried tobacco and furs back across the sea to London. To the north and west, stretching along the St. Lawrence River and into the Great Lakes, lay New France. A land of fur traders, missionaries, and soldiers. Sparse in population but vast in ambition. Between these rival empires lived the original nations of this continent. The Iroquois, the Huron, the Abenaki, the Algonquin, and many others. Nations whose alliances and choices would shape the fate of the land. Here, in this contested ground, Europe's great wars would find a new battlefield. But these were not wars of grand armies marching in neat lines. In America, war was brutal, personal, and close. It was the torch set to the cabin, the musket fired in the dark, the family torn from their beds. 3 great wars came before the final contest for empire. 3 wars that bled the frontier and scarred its people. They began with the flames of King William's War. The year was 1689. In Europe, crowns and kingdoms trembled. William of Orange had seized the throne of England in the Glorious Revolution, and Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, refused to bow to his rival. The War of the League of Augsburg erupted. And across the Atlantic, the colonies were swept into the storm. On the night of February 8, 1690, terror came to the town of Schenectady in New York. Snow covered the ground, the wind howled through the streets. Inside their wooden homes, English families slept soundly. Then the attack began. French soldiers and Abenaki allies burst into the town. Torches lit the night as doors were smashed and cabins set ablaze. Men and women fled into the cold, only to be cut down in the snow. Children were carried screaming into captivity. By dawn, Schenectady was a ruin, and 60 of its inhabitants lay dead. This was frontier war. Swift, savage, and merciless. The English struck back. With their Iroquois allies, they raided French villages in Canada, burning homes and scattering families. But the cycle of violence only deepened. In the summer of 1690, New England dared something bold. A fleet was assembled to strike at Quebec, the beating heart of New France. Ships sailed up the mighty St. Lawrence. But disease spread among the men, supplies dwindled, and French cannon thundered from the cliffs. The English fell back in humiliation. Quebec remained secure. For nearly a decade, raids and counter-raids scarred the borderlands. No village was safe. No harvest was secure. The Iroquois Confederacy, once strong, found itself weakened, trapped between the ambitions of 2 empires. When peace was finally signed in 1697, the Treaty of Ryswick returned the borders to their old lines. After years of blood and fire, nothing had changed. The only legacy was grief and bitterness. And the knowledge that this would not be the last war. In 1702, Europe burned again. The War of the Spanish Succession set crowns against crowns, and in America, it became known as Queen Anne's War. This war spread wider than before, from the icy forests of New England to the swamps of Florida. In Massachusetts, the settlers of Deerfield learned the price of empire. On a frozen February night in 1704, French and Abenaki warriors descended on the town. Doors splintered, flames rose into the winter sky. 48 settlers were slain, and more than 100 men, women, and children were dragged into the wilderness, marched north into captivity in Canada. The raid burned itself into colonial memory, a reminder that no one was beyond the reach of war. Far to the south, English Carolina clashed with Spanish Florida. In 1702, English forces attacked St. Augustine, burning the town, though the stone fortress, the Castillo de San Marcos, withstood their assault. The fighting spread inland, where English allied creeks struck against Spanish mission towns. Entire native communities were uprooted, centuries-old villages reduced to ash. On the seas, privateers prowled the Caribbean, their cannons booming as English and French ships hunted each other across warm waters. Yet even amid this chaos, the English saw opportunity. In 1710, Port Royal, the French capital of Acadia, fell to British arms. It was a victory that gave England control of Nova Scotia. Encouraged, they launched a grand assault on Quebec in 1711, backed by one of the largest fleets ever seen in American waters. But storms scattered the ships, drowning soldiers and sailors alike. Disease stalked the survivors. Once again, Quebec stood untaken. When peace finally came with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, the map of North America was redrawn. France ceded Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Hudson Bay to Britain. Yet Quebec and the Mississippi Valley remained firmly in French hands. The English colonies had grown in power and confidence. The French had lost ground but clung to their interior empire. And both sides knew the fight was far from finished. Time passed, but peace never lasted long. In 1744, another European conflict. The War of the Austrian Succession spilled into America. Colonists called it King George's War. Once more, frontier villages fell to fire and raid. New England towns lived in constant fear of sudden attack. Families farmed with muskets close at hand, knowing the forest could erupt with enemies at any moment. But this war would see a remarkable triumph. Rising on Cape Breton Island stood the fortress of Louisbourg, France's mightiest bastion in the New World. Guarding the entrance to the St. Lawrence River, it was said to be impregnable. In 1745, the colonists dared the impossible. A ragtag army of New England farmers, fishermen, and merchants marched north, backed by the guns of a British fleet. For 47 days, they battered the fortress. Mud, disease, and hunger tested their resolve. Yet slowly, the French defenses cracked. Against all expectation, Louisbourg surrendered. The news thundered across the Atlantic. The colonists had captured the Gibraltar of the North. Their victory became a symbol of courage, determination, and colonial strength. But triumph turned to betrayal. In 1748, the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle ended the war. And by its terms, Louisbourg was returned to France in exchange for lands in Europe. The colonists were stunned. Their greatest sacrifice, their proudest victory, had been handed back as if it were nothing. Anger simmered. Doubts about Britain's regard for its colonies began to grow. Though loyalty remained, the seeds of resentment had been sown. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle brought peace, but it was an uneasy peace. The old borders remained, the tensions unresolved. France rebuilt Louisbourg. Britain held Nova Scotia. The Ohio Valley, rich, fertile, and strategic, remained contested ground. For English settlers, whose numbers swelled with each passing year, the lure of the West was irresistible. For the French, whose strength lay in alliances with native nations and the fur trade, the encroachment of English settlers was a threat that could not be ignored. The wars of King William, Queen Anne, and King George had burned villages, toppled towns, and left thousands dead or displaced. Yet they had settled nothing. They were preludes, bitter rehearsals for the great struggle to come. These early wars were not simply battles between distant kings. They were wars of survival for the people of North America. English farmers, French trappers, native warriors, enslaved Africans. All were drawn into the tide of empire. From the ashes of Schenectady to the captives of Deerfield, from the smoldering ruins of St. Augustine to the walls of Louisbourg, the continent bore the scars of these struggles. They were wars fought in darkness and snow, in swamps and seas, by ordinary men and women caught in extraordinary times. And though treaties signed in Europe ended each conflict, the deeper struggle endured. The rivalry of England and France would not be decided until the greatest of them all, the French and Indian War, broke upon the continent. Only then would the fate of North America be sealed.